everybody, and welcome back to day 9 of the Heaven podcast. I'm Chris, and I'm here with
Becky, hello.
and we're really looking forward to steering you through day 9 of our podcast. Thanks for joining us up to now. And throughout this podcast, we're trying to unpack a little bit more of what heaven is going to be like, what awaits us in heaven. We're trying maybe to deal with some of the myths that go around heaven, and just trying to present a picture of what God tells us that heaven is going to be like. So whether you're a person of faith or not a person of faith, we hope that this is helpful. It's something really important for us to think about, and can provide us with a hope, we think, of life beyond this one, and what that can do and how that can shape our lives today. So, Becky, day 9, how are you feeling
Day
so
9.
far?
Good, ready, energized. We're going to be talking today about what's actually going to be going on in heaven. And we're returning to a book that we've looked at already in this series a couple of days ago. We were in the book of Revelation, which we said was a very unique book in the way that it's written. The final book in the Bible that contains some very vivid but often quite bizarre imagery about kind of what's going to happen at the end, what heaven will be like. And what's going to happen when God brings heaven down to earth. And this revelation comes from a guy called John. We've already talked about John. He was an eyewitness to Jesus's life. He wrote other books in the New Testament, like the Gospel of John. That's the account of Jesus's life according to John. And he writes this revelation, which is a series of visions, really, isn't it? Of things that were revealed to him about what would be coming. And he writes it to churches to encourage them with the picture of where Jesus stands in relation to them now, and where they will one day stand in relation to God when they are in heaven. So today we're in chapter 22, Chris. Do
Yeah.
we need any other contexty bits
I don't
for
think so.
chapter
I think
22?
the only thing I would add is to remember, as we're reading this and you and I are trying to help each other and our listeners understand a little bit more about this, that John is writing in this kind of visionary kind of way. So we have to be careful about taking a really literal interpretation of this, and just remember that these are kind of visions that God has given to John to kind of paint this quite graphic picture of what it could be like. So I think as we read it, it's just important that we're all keeping that in our minds, the way that we're reading this and what we're taking from it. So shall I read?
Yeah,
Our
go for
reading
it.
for today is from Revelation chapter 22. And again, all through this, we're encouraging you to either just listen in if you're doing something where you can't access a Bible, like driving or something like that. But if you have one in front of you, then great, you can follow along with us in that way. So this is Revelation 22. Verses 1 to 6. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign for ever and ever. The angel said to me, "These words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God who inspires the prophets, sent his angel to show his servants the things that must soon take place."
Okay. So first thing that strikes me is that we've got a few sort of characters, people being introduced in this passage that we might not know who they are. So um, there's the angel, who I guess is the figure, kind of the guide
Yeah,
in John's visions. Yeah,
yeah,
like sort of
absolutely.
showing John different pictures of heaven. So then we've got flowing down from the throne of God and of the Lamb.
Yes.
Who is the Lamb?
The Lamb, yes. So the Lamb is Jesus. So referred to, in fact, all the way through the Bible, really, in the kind of Old Testament prophecies that talked about the saving one who was to come and who would save all of humanity, often talked about as a lamb. And all the way through the New Testament, Jesus is often referred to as the Lamb of God. And that kind of goes back to, we talked a little bit about sacrifices yesterday, and that was a common thing in Old Testament kind of times, times that faith kind of, or religions, would have at their core this kind of sacrificial system of sacrificing something to make payment for things people were doing wrong or whatever it might be. And the Jewish faith had that idea too, and that often it was a lamb, or sometimes it was a lamb that was sacrificed to kind of atone for wrongdoings that people were doing, and so on. So the picture of Jesus as the Lamb of God really stems back to that idea, and Jesus would sacrifice his life ultimately to set people free, to pay for the sins of the world, and that kind of thing. And actually, once Jesus had made that sacrifice, that whole sacrificial system was not needed anymore, because the perfect lamb had laid
Yeah.
down his life for the
Okay.
sake of people. So so the lamb is a title, a very long way of saying a lamb is a title. The lamb is the title there for Jesus.
Okay, so we've got God, we've got the Lamb, who is Jesus.
Mm,
We've got then a third person, well, actually, a group of people, servants, they're called first. His servants will serve him.
mm,
They will see his face. His name will be on their foreheads. And then at the end, it says, and they will reign forever and ever.
yeah.
So who is this group of people?
Yeah, so we think there that John, in his vision, is referring to the followers of Jesus, so the people who are serving in the best possible sense, and we might either unpack that now, or come back to that a little bit later on. Serving Jesus, following Jesus, giving their lives to the purposes and plans of Jesus, and I'll say it now. That name on their foreheads thing is something that was used sometimes to kind of display an ownership kind of thing, again in a very negative sense. In the time of Jesus, sadly, people could be owned by somebody else. There was slaves that were owned by masters, and sometimes the slave master's name would be written on the forehead of the slave that was owned. So it was that idea of, this is who these people belong to. So that there is, in a much more positive sense, a mark that here are people who belong to God, not out of any kind of pressure, or being forced, or being kind of sold into, as a slavery thing would happen, but out of joy, out of a desire and a free choice to be followers of Jesus and to be in God's family. So ownership can have a very negative connotation, and it would have done certainly in lots of circumstances. Not so in this case. So servants, people who belong to God, and who are people who have been following Jesus.
That phrase, his name will be on their foreheads, that, I don't know, it reminds me, and maybe this is a coincidence, I don't know whether this is a parallel you're supposed to see here, but um, way back earlier on in the story of the Bible, when God had chosen his people, the people of Israel, and brought them out of Egypt and decided that they would be his people, when he first gives them his commands, his way to live, he says, I want you to tie it to your
Yeah,
forehead, put it onto your hands, tie it round your door frames, my words to you as a reminder of who you are. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that echoing here as well, that now it won't be the law that was given to Israel that will be tied onto your foreheads as a reminder of who you are, but it will be the name of
yeah,
Jesus,
yeah.
whether that's
I think that's
coincidental or.
totally understandable, and yeah, I think that's a very um, good way of thinking about it. I think that's a totally legitimate thing to read into that.
So what's the point of this vision, do you think? What's being shown to John, and what is John trying to share with us?
Yeah, well, I think we've got to tie back here a little bit to some of the things that we've been talking about before. So yesterday or the day before. So I think the day before, in Revelation, the previous chapter to this, in Revelation 21, we were talking about a new heaven and a new earth. So heaven is not kind of some other place. Ultimately, heaven and earth come together in a restored creation here on earth. So I think we've got to get that and understand that, and understand that that's the context in which this is being talked about. So this is giving us a picture, imagery, for what this new heaven and new earth will look like. And I think, very importantly, what's right at the heart of that, what's right at the center of it.
Yeah.
And again, we've got this picture of right at the center of all of this being this city, this place that is the source of all the good things that are spreading out from it into the rest of this new heaven and new
Mm.
earth, and right at the center of the city, as the source of all of that, is God. So when I read these verses, I one of the key themes that's coming through to me in here is this power source for this new heaven and new earth. And the power source is God. You've got water, the water of life flowing out from God. You've got the light that is needed in this new heaven and new earth, no longer coming from a sun or a light, coming from God. So that just speaks to me all the time of the source of life, the source of light, the source of power, the source of healing for the nations, all of that, all flowing out from this center at which is God. So for me, that feels like a key point of these verses, and perhaps the key thing we're supposed to take away from this imagery of John's vision. Does that
Yeah.
does that resonate with you? Would you share that thought, or are there other
Absolutely, yeah.
things that are
That
striking
that
you from it?
idea of the God being the source of everything and the source of that life is really evident here, isn't it? And the thing that's actually striking me as I look at it now is that is the source of the life that God provides. It means that there is stuff going on. And
Yep.
I don't know about you or about people listening, but when if anyone ever describes sort of eternity or heaven that goes on forever, I think of it almost as like being stuck in the same state all the time. Like, and sometimes that doesn't sound very appealing
Yes.
that it will be quite static. But the picture here is very alive and active. There's a river flowing. There are trees that bear fruit month after month after month.
Mm,
So there is a passage of time here in some way. Um, it says the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the
yeah.
nations. That to me sounds like healing is going on. It isn't just they've been healed
Yes.
and now we will just sit happily on a cloud for eternity,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
but that there's healing and serving one another. We're going to act as servants. That stuff's going on, and God is doing things. He's moving, he's acting. um, it's a very vivid, active picture, and I think that's a little different from how we sometimes think about eternity, actually.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. It's so interesting that you should say that. We've talked a lot about this guy Tom Wright, or sometimes known as NT Wright,
Yeah.
who we love because he's unpacked so much of this theology of kind of heaven and that kind of stuff. And he in his writing about these verses, he talks about a bustling kind of hubbub city, giving that sense of exactly what you say: activity, comings and goings, people kind of wandering in and out of the city all the time. This life, this river is flowing through the middle of it. There is growth and fruit from the
Mm.
trees on either side of the river. All of that kind of stuff. So yeah, you're picking up on something that I noticed when I read his stuff about this. He was really picking up. It's a hive of activity. It's not, yeah, what we might, not everybody sitting around,
Yeah.
bored out of their minds.
Yeah.
There's a whole loads of stuff going on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we've talked about this picture being painted. God is the power source of
yeah,
heaven. There is no longer any need for any other source of power, and we interact with God directly, and we have Him as our source of life. We've talked about this being a very active picture. There's stuff going on. It's full of life, full of energy. What difference does having a picture of heaven and a new heaven and a new earth that looks like this? What difference do you think that makes to our hope in heaven and how we live?
yeah. Well, it sounds much more interesting to me
Mm.
than some of the pictures we've previously had painted for us. And I think one of the reasons why, and I think this is true whether we would be people of faith or not people of faith, no matter where we're coming at from all of this, I think one of the things why we so often want to cling on to the things of this world rather than secure our hope in heaven is because honestly, heaven hasn't sounded very attractive to us. We've talked about this before on this podcast and in the talks that go along with this podcast. If heaven is sitting around on clouds with an eternal worship service going on, doesn't matter how good the music is, that doesn't sound very exciting. Whereas this sounds much more interesting. And again, we have to be careful about you know taking this too literally, but the idea of activity and of growth and of water and flowing and fruit and bustle and a city, yeah, all of that in the presence of God who has, as we heard a couple of days ago, wiped any suffering, pain, discomfort, tears from our eyes, all of that kind of stuff. That sounds much more interesting to me, and is something that I think will stir in us, should stir in us a much greater sense of hope and of looking forward to that time,
Yeah.
rather than clinging on for all that we can to all that we have and all that we think makes us comfortable and happy in this
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's also much of this is, whilst it's a picture of this future heaven and earth, it's echoing language that Jesus used, that other people have used to talk about life with God
Mm.
now. So, John, in fact, the John who wrote this vision down, in his account of Jesus's life, he talks about Jesus saying that anybody who comes to me, who is thirsty and comes to me, rivers of living water
Yeah.
will flow up from within them. And that echoes this picture of the river of the water of life that flows from the throne of God in this picture here. And there's other parts in the Bible where it talks about justice, let justice flow like a river. Um, so it's not just a picture of the future, it's a reminder of the difference it makes when God's will is active in our lives now, and when we allow ourselves to be shaped by Him, and we treat Him as our source of life today, not just in the future, that it's like a river of water flows through us and out of us and into the world around us, and
Yeah.
it's life-giving in that way too.
Yes. And echoes of Old Testament prophecies that talked about waters of life. And I noticed that again, I think 2 days ago, 2 podcasts ago, when we were looking at Revelation 21, the water of life was mentioned there. So you're so right. This constant theme of the water of life,
Yeah.
and of course, water for some of the people in the days of John and Jesus and that kind of stuff. I mean, water was a precious commodity. Living in hot countries, places where water might have been scarce, places where you didn't necessarily drink the water because it could make you ill.
Mm.
All of that kind of stuff. Um, Water would have been on their minds a lot, I think, and about how to get it and all of that kind of stuff. So when this language is used, people would again have resonated totally. Yeah, water is life. We need water, not to live, to grow crops, to all of that kind of stuff. So they would have got that
Yes.
completely. And
Yeah.
this imagery of God as the water of life, and where there is water, there is growth and greenery and beautiful flowers and crops and all of that kind of stuff. I think would have been really resonant with the culture of the day, and maybe it isn't quite so much for us.
I think this is a brilliant picture for anybody whose faith feels like it's become a little bit stale,
Mm.
or who thinks faith is quite stale, who's standing on the outside perhaps of faith looking in and thinking that sounds a little boring. Like,
Yeah.
that actually the vision that's being painted here is not stale at all. It's vibrant, it produces things, it produces life, it's like springing up. Yeah.
And I think there's this other promise that I just want to pick up on too, the last part of verse 5. And we talked about the servants, the people who are following Jesus, they will reign forever and ever. So it's what that says to me is there's a partnership thing going on in heaven, where those who are there, those who have had their faith in Jesus, who are following Jesus, will be part of the fruit that's happening, the life that's there. That we will be part of the productivity, if you like, or the rule of
Yeah.
heaven. We will be involved in, and I don't. It's difficult to know exactly what that looks like, but at the very least, it implies to me a partnership in with God in what's going on in heaven.
Right.
We're reigning with Him,
Yeah.
and not under Him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we don't just have a purpose now to live in the direction of heaven. When we get to heaven, we will be given a purpose
Yes.
that will have a role to play.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. And
Mm.
we are not going to be passive recipients
Yes.
of what's happening in
Yeah.
heaven. We are going to be co-workers. I don't know whether
Yeah.
that's the right word, but contributors is
Yeah.
maybe a better word to all this amazing stuff that's going on. And that I have to say that struck me afresh or anew, or like in a way it hadn't struck me before when we were
Mm,
preparing for today. Oh,
yeah.
okay, hold on. I've perhaps thought of myself too much as a passive recipient of heaven,
Mm,
not a co-contributor to what's going on in heaven.
that's brilliant. No one can see my facial expression, but my jaw literally dropped there. I thought that was really good. Yeah. Wow. We're going to talk a bit more about purpose in the next episode,
Yeah,
actually, aren't we?
yeah, yeah.
But could we get a tweet out of this vision of John here?
Have you? Do you? Who's going first?
Oh dear, look.
I feel like I need to say something about that passive recipient, but that wasn't what
Yeah.
I'd kind of thought in
I
my
feel like that
preparation.
should have
So,
been the tweet. Go
yeah,
back, scrub back if you're
yes.
listening to this podcast. That's the tweet.
So, yeah. So yeah. So there needs to be something about the power source. I think
Mm,
that is a key thing, but there needs to be something in our tweet about
yeah.
that the promise is not that we will be passive recipients of
Yeah.
heaven, but co-contributors with heaven.
Yeah.
So we're nearly there.
In heaven, God will be the source of a new kind of life. In that life, we will be co contributors, not passive recipients.
Yay! That's
Oh,
brilliant.
I don't know.
Brilliant. I love it. Can I say one more thing
Yeah, go
that's
on.
like on my heart to share about the whole story of God? Because this is the last chapter in the Bible, in the story of God. And I love, and again, it might just be me and my slightly kind of nerdy kind of thing. I love how the story of God is framed by trees. So in the very first opening of the story of God, you've got this tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the middle of this Garden of Eden, this image that's portrayed for us about the perfect world before human beings kind of mess it up. And you've got this amazing tree right at the center of the garden. And here we've got the tree of life right at the center of heaven. And you've got you've got these two trees bookmarking the story of God, and of course you've got the tree in the middle of it, which is the cross of Jesus. And I love that so often God's story does this. There are these wonderful symmetries, or kind of it's almost
Symmetries.
poetic symmetries. Very good. And that again just strikes me here that you've got this tree of life that. Um, all of God's story is about recovering, if you like, or being saved by God from that moment where human beings mess up by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And all of the rest of God's story is about setting that right. And now, right at the end of God's story, in the middle of the city, in the middle of this new heaven and new earth, is this fruit-bearing tree that is the tree of life.
Yeah.
That for me, that's lovely. I
Wow.
just think that's brilliant. But
Yeah.
that's a little nerdy thing
No,
that I love.
I think that's great. I'm a bit of a nerd too, and I hope people listening are becoming nerds through this podcast.
Share your nerdiness
That's
with
the,
us.
yes. So, should we move on to what's next? Our final question. In part, I think what's next for this is listen again to the next episode because we're going to be talking about living with that end in mind. How talking a little bit more about if you fix your eyes on that as the picture of the future, how do you run towards that in the today, and how do we live with purpose today?
Brilliant.
But have you got any other what's next,
No,
Chris?
no, I think that's great, and I think I mean it's not a what's next, particularly from this one. It's a what's next from some of the other stuff we've talked about. That if this is what awaits us in heaven, and the promise is that we can see heaven breaking in on earth today, as we live between the trees. So after the tree in the garden where
Mm,
everything goes wrong, not quite yet at the tree of life in heaven. We're living between the trees. We can see something of heaven breaking in on earth when we, in partnership with God, as you said earlier, bring good to the world, the water of life, the source of good to the world in the way we act and
mm,
behave if we're followers of Jesus, the way we act and behave
yeah.
in bringing God's goodness into the world
Wow.
today.
Yeah. Chris, if you ever release an album, will you promise people right on this podcast right now that it will be called Between the Trees? Because I think that is excellent.
Yeah, I will absolutely promise that, because if you've ever heard me sing or stood next to me, you've done this, so stood next to me in a worship service, you will know that there is no way ever in the world anybody is going to allow me to release an album. So yes, I'm happy to promise that the album that I'll never
Yeah.
release will be called Between the Trees.
Brilliant. Well, we will catch up with you on the next episode of the podcast. Yeah, do stay tuned. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. And yeah, we look forward to talking with you more about this hope that we have in heaven. Thanks, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks, Becky.